What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. It's been way too long since I created a proper top 10 list on this channel, and with Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey right around the corner, I decided to cook up a video celebrating my top 10 favorite movies set in the world of Greek mythology. And as far as Nolan's movie is concerned, my attitude is, I'm hoping for the best, but I'm prepared for the worst. Because if the movie ends up being an interesting blend of both good and terrible creative decisions, it would by no means be the first time when it comes to movies about Greek mythology. But we'll cross that bridge in a few months' time. For now, let's focus on more or less the last century of Greek mythology adaptations, which I've been researching off and on for the last couple of months. And I've tried my best to throw out a very wide net watching movies from all around the world. And while I won't claim to have seen every Greek mythology movie ever made, I can safely say that I've seen a lot more than most people you'll ever talk to, because I've seen classic interpretations, I've seen schlocky genre films, I've seen loose modern day homages, and I've even managed to see a few movies actually made in Greece that adapt some of the most famous Greek tragedies written thousands of years ago. While it was very easy to find movies that have amazing individual ingredients, it's also incredibly rare to find a movie that I 100% like from start to finish. In fact, I don't think there are any movies that I like 100% from start to finish. But that does not mean that they're not a lot of fun to talk about, because I've been a fan of Greek myths throughout my entire life, starting when I was a little boy when my dad would tell me bedtime stories. Sometimes he'd tell me stories about superheroes, but other times he'd be telling me stories about Theseus or Hercules or Perseus and all of his favorite heroes. And his goal obviously was to get me to fall asleep, but usually the exact opposite would happen, because I would have all these follow-up questions to ask about the adventures that he was describing. But then 1 month shy of my 5th birthday, I was taken to see Clash of the Titans in the theater, and my fate was sealed. And I had no idea at that time how many liberties were being taken with the adaptation, nor did I appreciate at the time that it would be the final movie featuring the special effects by special effects wizard Ray Harryhausen. All I cared about at the time was what I perceived as an epic tale of high adventure. And the fact that there were action figures available related to the movie only intensified my interest. In any event, I got very lucky when it came to my education and ended up studying Greek myths as well as classic Greek tragedies at different stages throughout my childhood, all the way up through college. And like a lot of nerdy kids back in the 1980s, I was obsessed with D'Aulaire's book of Greek myths, and I read it repeatedly. And of course, the big debate back then between all the kids was, how the hell do you pronounce the name of this author? I'm still not completely convinced that I have it correct. But after reading the book several times, I shifted over into Dungeons and Dragons, and they had this book called Deities and Demigods. And basically, if you were running a D&D campaign and wanted to incorporate all the great characters of Norse mythology or Egyptian mythology or whatever the case might be, they had stats for all the heroes and all the gods. And actually, I'll include one scandalous pick from back in the day, because as a little kid reading these D&D books, some of my first encounters with the female form were when I bumped into the description of Aphrodite, and yes, she is buck-ass nude, which was a huge thrill at age 7 or 8, whenever I was first getting into all this stuff. But in high school and college, my interest intensified because I started getting exposed to some of the original texts, obviously translated into English. I cannot read Homer in the original Greek, but there are people out there who pride themselves on being able to do so. But as a freshman in high school, I got exposed to Sophocles through the play Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, and that blew my mind. I was like, whoa! You mean like homework and Greek mythology can be like one and the same? Like, oh, like I think I found my sweet spot. Then as a junior, we got into the Odyssey. And I always recommend the Robert Fagles translation of the Odyssey. And not only is it a great translation, if you listen to the audio fiction read by Ian McKellen, it is also the Robert Fagles translation. And I would argue the Ian McKellen recording of the Robert Fagles translation is probably the best piece of media that I've ever been exposed to when it comes to adapting a Greek myth into a different form of media. Obviously, it's just reading the poem, but there's something about hearing Gandalf himself describing all these incredible events in Odysseus' life as he's trying to get home, where it just really hammers home just like the epic grandeur of these stories. But a close second would be the Derek Jacobi reading of the Iliad, also translated by Robert Fagles. I read this high school, I can't quite remember when I first read it, but Derek Jacobi, who's a close friend of Ian McKellen, he did a great audiobook of the Iliad back in the day. And anyway, I would drive around Los Angeles in the late 90s listening to Derek Jacobi describing the tension between Achilles and Agamemnon, and I was just couldn't have been happier. But in my final Greek mythology class in college, we started studying the plays of Aeschylus, the father of Greek tragedy, and we also started getting into Euripides. And I still have my 10 plays by Euripides. I think I read 2 of them when I was like 23, which is great because for this video, I saw a few adaptations of Euripides plays for the first time, but I'll be getting to that later in the video. So long story short, I would never describe myself as a scholar of Greek mythology, but I'm definitely an enthusiast. I enjoy Greek mythology. I enjoy reading it, I enjoy consuming it, and I sure as hell enjoy watching movies that try, and more often than not fail, to adapt these stories. Because for me, the perfect Greek mythology movie needs to be a blend of two kind of opposing ingredients. You need to have like the Shakespearean grandeur of a classic tragedy written, 2,500 years ago, but you also need to have like the barbarism and the brutality of basically like Conan the Barbarian. And I feel like most adaptations of Greek mythology lean too far into one direction at the expense of the other. But you basically, you need to find that perfect sweet spot where if somebody is speaking in really sophisticated verse, it seems totally appropriate. Or if they're just pulling out a spear and jabbing it into somebody's belly before hacking their head off, that also should be equally appropriate. And a show like Rome, while it's not Greek mythology, it's probably one of the best examples of blending those two creative impulses, where it feels brutal when it needs to feel brutal and it feels sophisticated when it needs to feel sophisticated. But the most frustrating thing about being both a movie fan as well as a Greek mythology fan is that so few movies are willing to trust the stories that have remained popular for 2,500 years. And it's one thing if like a book's been around for 10 years and it has legions of fans and people take a few liberties, but I'm like, people have been telling these stories for quite literally like for millennia. Like nations have risen and fallen in that time, and yet these stories continue to endure. People still love the statues and they love the paintings and they love everything about these stories. And yet, almost never do movies actually, like even if you don't want to do the verse, but very rarely do movies even like capture like the structure of the original stories. A perfect example would be a movie like The Immortals. They took the name of the character Theseus and they took the entire story of Theseus and they just told a completely new original story. It's like, well, then why'd you call him Theseus? Like, just call him anything. Come up with any Greek name you like, cast Henry Cavill, and then nobody will complain, because a movie like The Immortals, it's got the style and the flavor and the tone that you want from Greek mythology, but it doesn't actually adapt any Greek mythology, so that's incredibly frustrating. And maybe you might be saying to yourself, you are such a nerd, who gives a shit? But if you like these stories, eventually you'd like to have at least one great adaptation.
I have moved every precious stone you people worship upon.
And my dream would be, is let's say somebody had limitless resources. They had billions of dollars at their disposal. Because all the stories are obviously in the public domain, I would like to see somebody create a fictional shared universe in movies where they start at quite literally the beginning of the story with like, the Titans and the war with the gods and all this stuff, then enter into the Age of Heroes, and then eventually enter into the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then put a big bow on it. But you could basically do like 10, 15, 20 movies on a grand scale, and some of those characters would be recurring characters. Like obviously Zeus would stick around, but even a character like Hercules pops up in other stories. Like if you watch Jason and the Argonauts from 1963, and spoiler alert, that is my favorite Greek mythology movie, Hercules is part of the crew, part of the Argonauts when they go in search of the Golden Fleece. So there would be some recurring characters, but honestly, the best thing we can hope for is that every once in a while a great filmmaker will come along and take a crack at one of these legendary stories. And who knows, maybe one of these days somebody will actually try to do just a faithful adaptation of one of these legendary stories. Because some of my biggest concerns about the Nolan film, I know right now everybody's talking about the casting and who's playing which characters. My biggest concern is hearing words like daddy or dad in the trailer, because when I explore Greek mythology, I don't want modern day speech, I don't want modern day vernacular. I know they're trying to make it more accessible to a modern audience, but I want to step into another world. I want the stories and the values and the style and the atmosphere of a story that is quite literally thousands of years old. And I'm sorry, if I hear the word daddy...
You're pining for a daddy you didn't even know, like some sniveling bastard.
It makes me think I'm watching like a porn parody or something like that with all the Greek gods, or like having some orgy up on Mount Olympus. It just immediately takes me out of this otherworldly environment that I want to explore. And also when you hear all these strange things that he's saying about how like, well, we're not going to use like a traditional score because like those instruments didn't exist back then. I'm like, but cameras didn't exist back then. IMAX cameras didn't exist back then. So if you're going to have that kind of philosophy about your story, well, then you got to be consistent. And basically, if you want to do the story with just the tools that were available thousands of years ago, you basically would have two people in togas on a stage just performing in front of a live audience. Like that is how you would do it if you're trying to do it in the most traditional way humanly possible. Or when I hear Nolan offering these feeble explanations as to why he's trying to incorporate rap through Travis Scott into the movie, I'm like, well, rap didn't exist back then, but a Greek chorus did. You can have a Greek chorus, but Anyway, let's wait until July, and then we will judge the movie on its own terms, because there's still a chance that some of the scenes might blow my mind. But when I hear Matt Damon screaming, "Let's go," before a bunch of people charge into battle, like my 10-year-old nephew, he says "let's go" when he's watching basketball games and gets excited. It's like, "Oh, let's go!" Their "let's go" is very appropriate. It's what kids say these days. I don't need to hear "let's go" when, like, the Greek armies are invading Troy or whatever the case might be. Let's go! Now, before I go any further, I should also acknowledge that throughout my life, I've been mispronouncing a lot of these names. And oftentimes, when you spend decades mispronouncing a name in your head when you're reading on the page, sometimes it's hard to make the switch, even after you've heard the correct pronunciation. But a lot of people get it wrong. Like, if you watch the movie Troy, made by Wolfgang Petersen in the early 2000s, they call the character of Menelaus Menelaus. And when you look at the spelling, oh yeah, Menelaus. But when you listen to the Odyssey read by Ian McKellen, when Telemachus goes to visit Menelaus, or Menelaus, at the beginning of the story, they call him Menelaus. So I'm always going to defer to the pronunciation by a very eloquent orator like Ian McKellen. And according to what I've researched online, Menelaus is the correct pronunciation. But there's some of these names that have absolutely been tying my tongue in knots my entire life, like the character of Hephaestus. I can't even remember how I used to try to pronounce his name as little. I was like Hephaestus or something. Anyway, I made a complete and total mess of it. But periodically throughout this video, I'm sure I will screw up the pronunciation of quite a few of these names. But along those lines, I'll also acknowledge I always defer to the Greek names over the Roman names, because there's a great diagram in the back of Delaire's Book of Greek Myths where it showed like all the major gods and figures. But in the book, they had both the Greek and the Roman names, because when the Roman Empire absorbed Greece, they also absorbed a lot of their myths and a lot of their culture. Back then, you were considered very educated and very sophisticated if you could speak Greek and you knew all the Greek myths and all the Greek tragedies. But I remember in the back of the book taking great pride in the fact that I knew the difference between Hermes versus Mercury, or Zeus versus Jupiter. And what drives me crazy in certain movies where you'll see them using some Roman names and some Greek names, I'm like, no, either use all Roman names or all Greek names. But I'm a total hypocrite, because the character of Hercules, if you're going by the Greek names, it's actually Heracles, but everybody calls him Hercules. But that is technically the Roman variant of the name of Heracles. But throughout this video, unless the movie is using the Roman names, I'm always going to use the Greek names when I can. But let's get into some of the rules for this list as to which movies might qualify, or which criteria that I'm using to judge whether or not the movies can be included, because I'm not including sword and sandal movies unless they also happen to be a Greek mythology movie. Like if you watch a movie set in Rome or set in ancient civilization, a couple hundred years BC, where they make a reference to the Greek gods, but there's actually nothing going on mythological, that doesn't count. I kept trying to tie myself in knots, because one movie that I really wanted to include was The Colossus of Rhodes, which is the feature film debut by Sergio Leone. And I kept trying to figure out, is there a way where I can justify or rationalize including a Sergio Leone movie in this list? But no, it's just a historical epic, a sword and sandal movie, but it's not actually an adaptation of any Greek myth, meaning that all the great sword and sandal movies and all the great gladiator movies, etc. and so forth, they do not qualify unless those movies are actually trying to adapt some of the famous Greek myths. And I had to make a decision early on whether or not to include movies that take inspiration from Greek myths but are not actually technically adaptations. Like a classic silent movie like Pandora's Box. It's obviously using the themes and the title of Pandora's Box, but it's not a Greek myth at all. Or take a movie like Orphée, directed by the legendary Jean Cocteau. When it was made, it was a modern-day adaptation of the story of Orpheus. I love the movie, and I've seen it many times, and I studied it in college. I'm not going to include it on this list, even though it's basically the story of Orpheus in France in the 1950s. But this is a list of the top 10 Greek mythology movies, and for me, it has to be, people wearing bronze armor, carrying swords and shields, walking around in togas. It needs to be set in a distant, bygone era, which also means that one of my all-time favorite movies is not going to be included on this list. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which I saw 5 times in the theater, and famously that movie won an Oscar for its adaptation of the Odyssey by Homer. But here's the deal. Joel and Ethan Coen, as much as I love and respect them as filmmakers, and I've made videos about their career on this channel in the past, they didn't even bother to read the Odyssey before doing their adaptations. They said, we got certain scenes from other forms of media, blah, blah, blah. But it basically was an original movie that happened to include, the sirens in one scene, and obviously the main character was Ulysses Everett McGill. The movie fucking rules, but it's much more, it owes as much of a debt of gratitude to the films of Preston Sturges, where the name of Brother Where Art Thou even comes from, as much as it does to Greek mythology. So even though I love and adore O Brother Where Art Thou, it is not going to be included on this list. But if I did include it on this list, there's a very good chance that it would be my #1 movie. And another movie which caused me deep pain not to include on the list is Contempt from Jean-Luc Godard, starring Brigitte Bardot.
Avec Brigitte Bardot et Michel Piccoli.
I first saw it in the theater in the late 90s at the New Art in Los Angeles. And that is a movie about the making of a movie of the Odyssey. And it's one of the best movies about the art of making movies ever made. And there are scenes in there where you can see them adapting the Odyssey. But that's much more a movie where it's about, like petty jealousies and rivalries and, all the behind the scenes plotting and scheming while making a movie. It is a movie about filmmaking. It's not a movie about the Odyssey. But it is one of the best movies that I've ever seen. And I've seen it more times than I can count. In theory, it should go on here, but I'm trying to make this list for fantasy nerds and mythology nerds, not for like film history nerds, which means movies like Contempt or movies like Black Orpheus, they're just not going to make the cut. Also, while I'm on the subject of movies like Orfeo or Black Orpheus, I should also acknowledge that legendary filmmaker Pier Paolo Pasolini made 2 Greek mythology movies in the late 60s. He made Oedipus Rex and Medea. And I went into those 2 movies with very high hopes because the final movie of Pasolini's career is one of the most shocking and outrageous movies in movie history. That's called Salo, or The 120 Days of Sodom. It is truly not for the faint of heart. If you're at all squeamish whatsoever, never watch Pasolini's final movie. And it's even rumored that he was murdered as a result of the final product of that movie. But throughout the 1960s and 70s, he really enjoyed exploring stories written a very long time ago. He did the Gospel according to St. Matthew. He did the Decameron. He did the Canterbury Tales. But here with Oedipus Rex and Medea, he tackled Greek mythology. The problem with these movies is that they have like these brief highlights that are really, really intense, but they are so agonizingly slow with almost no dialogue or no music where you will want to like tear your face off while watching these movies. But with Medea, I had such high hopes because the story of Jason and the Argonauts, depending upon where you choose to end the story, it'll either end in triumph or tragedy. The movie Jason and the Argonauts in 1963 ends in triumph. It gives you a happy ending. But most Greek myths, they don't have like a clear stopping point. The characters live on, and sometimes they go into very dark, depressing territory. And what eventually happens to Jason and his children and his new wife and all the horrible things that Medea does, I genuinely, sincerely hoped that Medea would be so fucking traumatizing that it would definitely make the top 10. But the reality is, unless you're just a true Criterion Collection fanatic who watches any movie that's part of the Criterion Channel or the Criterion Collection, where these 2 movies, Oedipus Rex and Medea, are available, but these movies do not necessarily have broad appeal. And I thought about this long and hard, but I finally made the decision only to include feature films as opposed to short films. But if I were to include short films, there's one very obvious clear-cut contender that I would definitely include in a top 10 list, and that would be the 1974 short film Sisyphus by Hungarian director Marcel Yankovic. And both as a little kid and as an adult, I've always been fascinated by these kind of endless torture scenarios that a lot of people are subjected to when they've done something horrible as a mortal, and when they go down to the underworld after their demise, how they're cursed for all time to endure some endless form of suffering. And Sisyphus 100% delivers on that front. But if you're interested in myth and legend and that sort of thing in the world of animation, Marcel Yankovic is one of the best directors that you could possibly get your hands on. Son of the White Mare is where I would recommend that you start, but then you've got Johnny Corncob, and you've got some other great animated movies by him as well. But if you're interested in Eastern European animation, Marcel Yankovic is one of the best to ever do it. And his film Sisyphus, he also did one about Prometheus in 1992, but Sisyphus is particularly good. But as I said earlier, this list is exclusively for feature films, meaning no TV shows. But if I were to include TV shows, the first one I would include would be Ulysses 31, which I just saw for the first time recently thanks to a lot of recommendations online. But it's a Japanese animated show from the early 80s. But it's like a futuristic space exploration equivalent or adaptation of the Odyssey. And just the introductory song during the opening credits, you're like, all right, dude, give me all the Ulysses 31 that you got. The show is an absolute delight.
Ulysses, no one else can do the things you do. Ulysses.
And I also considered including the show Rome from HBO because there's so many references to the Greek gods, but in the end, it's like, that's a history show about Julius Caesar and Augustus and so on and so forth. It's not a Greek mythology show. nor is Spartacus Blood and Sand. And I just discovered Spartacus Blood and Sand from 2010 for the first time recently. Fucking loved it. It's a really, really entertaining show. And the characters frequently make references to the Greek gods, but once again, it's not an adaptation of any Greek myth. It's just an adaptation of some Roman history. Highly recommend it, but it's not going to go on this list. And the last show that deserves an honorable mention that I've talked about a couple times on this channel before is Blood of Zeus, a Netflix show which I really enjoyed, but it's not adapting any existing Greek myths. It's basically using a lot of the most famous characters from Greek mythology and telling a fresh original story. And it was created by Charlie Parlapanides, if I'm saying that at all correctly, as well as Vias Parlapanides. I'm sure I'm getting both those names horribly wrong, but they are the writers who created The Immortals. And like with The Immortals, I will watch anything that is set within the world of Greek mythology. I would just prefer if these guys would actually try to adapt some of the existing Greek myths, but they much prefer to tell their own original stories using a few familiar names and that sort of thing. So more power to them. That is the path they've chosen to take as storytellers, but they're so talented. And they're obviously so invested in the world of Greek myths. I just wish they would try to take some of the best Greek myths and just do them right. Once again, they already tackled the world of Theseus through The Immortals. Why not actually do the story of Theseus as written? I think it would just be an absolute Hall of Fame movie-going experience. And I have the exact same attitude about a movie like Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief, which I just saw for the first time in preparation for this video. I never read the books, but basically have a scenario where all the children are all the offspring of the gods like, Poseidon, Hades, Zeus, etc. They're all going on an adventure. And anyway, I don't want to get into the plot of that, but it's a modern-day story. I don't consider that really an adaptation of Greek mythology, even though it's using a lot of the most famous figures in the pantheon. But that first movie is worth watching for one very important reason. Alexandra Daddario is so beautiful and so stunning in that movie that I spent half the movie just screaming and kind of clawing my eyes out like, oh my God, because I first discovered her like a lot of people did through True Detective, which came out 4 years after, and that was a very different kind of story, a very different kind of experience. But if you are obsessed with Alexandra Daddario and just want to watch her swinging a sword around and beating the fuck out of people, by all means take Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief for a spin. But I think at this point I've subjected you all to enough procrastinating and bullshitting on my part. Let's get to the official top 10 list. And for my number 10, I'm going to go with Hercules from 1958 starring Steve Reeves. Not because I think it's the best Hercules movie, although it might be the best Hercules movie, and maybe I'm too easy to please on this front, but because the movie does make a genuine, sincere effort to adapt some of the famous labors of Hercules, I'm satisfied. Watching Hercules crush the life out of the invulnerable Nemean lion, that makes me happy. And Steve Reeves is but one of many shredded actors to play this role over the years. But this movie was so popular that over the next couple years in Italy, there were 19 Hercules movies that came out, and he would have crossovers with Odysseus. He would have crossovers with any kind of character you could possibly mention. It almost got to be like the Universal monster movies of like the 30s and early 40s, where suddenly they just went crazy with all these crossovers. But Steve Reeves didn't play the character for long. We also had Reg Park, who played him a couple times in movies like Hercules and the Captive Women, which has one of the all-time great movie posters that I've ever seen, or a movie like Hercules and the Haunted World from 1961. Not necessarily the world's greatest adaptation of a Greek myth, but he's so big and he's so shredded, it's worth watching just because Reg Park was one of the idols of Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I first saw that movie thanks to Melanie Daniels, who exposed me to it back on Wrong Reel 611. But I just mentioned Arnold. Arnold also played Hercules in Hercules in New York, and for many years the movie was not available with Arnold's original audio. But if you're going to watch a movie as bad as Hercules in New York, you might as well get the full Arnold Schwarzenegger experience, because if you have Arnold's voice, at least the movie's kind of like, ridiculous and hilarious in a lot of ways.
But you wouldn't like it down there.
Let me be the judge of that. I am tired of the same old phrases. The same old things.
Tired or not, you're staying here.
We also had Lou Ferrigno. He played Hercules in the 1983 film, produced by Canon Films, which brings in like robots and spaceships and all kinds of crazy shit. But that movie's probably most famous or most infamous for the moment, where Hercules comes upon a bear that has just killed his foster father, and Hercules beats the shit out of the bear, hurls him into space, where he bounces around like a pool ball, like creating a constellation. Totally ridiculous. But even if the Lou Ferrigno version of Hercules is borderline unwatchable, it does feature one asset, or perhaps two assets, that make it worth a look, and that is the lovely Sybil Danning. And this is an important lesson for anybody attempting to adapt Greek myths as movies. Even if your movie's completely wretched, if you feature enough scantily clad beautiful women in your movie, there's a very good chance you're going to make your money back. And most recently, we saw The Rock play Hercules in the Brett Ratner film. My biggest complaint about the Brett Ratner film, apart from it being a Brett Ratner film, is the fact that they tried to bleed all the mythology out of it and come up with realistic explanations for why these myths came to be. When I'm watching a Greek mythology movie, and this is an attitude that I have towards a lot of these Greek mythology movies, too many of them try to have a grounded, gritty interpretation where they can explain how the myths came to be, but they don't actually include the supernatural or the gods and goddesses or all the creatures and monsters and that sort of thing. And if I'm watching a movie about Hercules, I want the full, undiluted, unbridled experience. I don't need it to be like an explanation as to how the myths came to be. So I fucking hated The Rock as Hercules. I hated that movie overall. But every once in a while, Hercules will pop up in other movies. We're like, hey, it's Hercules. Like, he pops up in Jason and the Argonauts, my favorite Greek mythology movie. He doesn't have one of the main roles, but he definitely is featured prominently early in the story. But when it comes to picking my official top 10 for this list, I got to go with the original guy who kind of set it all in motion. Because if not for Steve Reeves and that absolutely ridiculous physique that he enjoyed back in the late 50s, but if not for the success of that early Steve Reeves Hercules movie from 1958, we probably would have not seen nearly as many Greek mythology movies get made. And there were a few notable Greek mythology movies made before then. There was a big one in 1924, there was a big Greek mythology movie in 1954, and there was a big one in 1956, all of which I'll get to in short order. But I feel like the success of Steve Reeves' interpretation, like in Italy, anytime you have a successful movie, whether it's a horror movie or a Western or Greek mythology or historical epic or whatever the case may be, it spawns a lot of imitation movies. And I feel like every Greek mythology movie made since 1958 owes a partial debt of gratitude to the popularity of that interpretation. But moving on to my number 9.
Θεοί μίλησαν.
We have a movie which I just saw for the first time yesterday, and I'm still not entirely sure that I'm saying the name correctly, but it's Iphigenia or Iphigenia, but it's from 1977. But what was really important to me going into this list was to try to discover at least one movie made in Greece about Greek mythology that is really good. And eventually I came across the films of Michael Kakoyannis, if I'm saying his name correctly. He's most famous for directing the movie Zorba the Greek back in the 1960s, but he actually made a trilogy of Greek tragedy movies, and I've seen 2 of them. I've seen Electra from 1962, starring Irene Papas as the daughter of Clytemnestra. She's playing Electra in the movie. But then in Iphigenia, or Iphigenia, however you say it, she then is playing Clytemnestra, which is interesting because the stories are being told out of order, but you have the same lead actress playing prominent roles. But in any case, Irene Papas, she's an absolute titan of the Greek film industry. And last night, as I was watching Electra for the first time, late at night, I very nearly decided to include Electra in my top 10 instead of Iphigenia, because I actually read Electra back in college, and I'm a little bit more attached to the story. But the original Electra was written back in 413 BC by Euripides, but Euripides actually wrote 2 plays about the character of Iphigenia. This movie is based on the story Iphigenia in Aulis, which is estimated to have been written sometime around 408 or 406 BC, but it was first performed in 405 BC. But these stories, whether you're talking about Electra or Iphigenia, they are just absolutely ruthless and savage. And I remember I was talking earlier about how when it comes to Greek mythology, I need a mix of the sublime when it comes to theatrical arts, but also need that ruthless brutality. But what I like about both these movies is how they fill in the gaps on some of the darkest chapters of the life of Agamemnon, who's the most powerful Greek king during the Trojan War. And with Electra, it deals with the aftermath of his assassination. He comes home, he brings a mistress along. I believe her name is Cassandra. And the first thing that happens is his wife Clytemnestra and her lover murder Agamemnon. In the story of Electra, the children are separated, and they eventually, when they grow up, they get revenge, and they kill the murderer of Agamemnon. But it's like a ruthless, bloody revenge story. But in Iphigenia, the story that I decided, and I know I keep going back and forth between Iphigenia and Iphigenia. I keep hoping that if I say both like enough, at least I'll be right 50% of the time. But this story is absolutely ruthless. It takes place right before the Trojan War, and the entire Greek army is getting ready to sail over to Troy to wreak havoc, but there's no wind, because they've offended the goddess Artemis. And basically they come up with this scheme where if they make a sacrifice to Artemis, she will allow the wind to blow. And so Agamemnon, the dirty dog that he is, he comes up with this scheme where he asks for his daughter, Iphigenia, to be sent to him. He claims she's going to be married to Achilles. But what she does not know is that upon her arrival, she's going to be sacrificed to Artemis, and then the wind can blow. But by the time she arrives, not only does she bring her mother, and she's all excited, oh my God, my daughter's going to marry Achilles, but we have a situation where thousands of Greek soldiers are ready to set sail. So even though Agamemnon's starting to get cold feet and doesn't necessarily want to sacrifice his innocent daughter, he knows that if he doesn't, he's surrounded by all these bloodthirsty bastards that are going to rip him limb from limb. And so what I like about this movie is that it just shows the internal torment of Agamemnon. Like, is he willing to sacrifice his precious angelic daughter with this lie and with this horrible sacrifice so that he can go off to Troy and achieve great glory and, fighting all these giant battles and blah, blah, blah. I don't know how much the movie, The Odyssey, is going to deal with Agamemnon apart from his weird Batman helmet that we've all seen in the trailers, but Agamemnon, he's one of the most important characters in the Iliad, and I just like how between these two movies we get some really cool, gritty Greek portrayals of the story of Agamemnon, or at least chapters from his life. But along those lines, there's one other Greek movie about Greek mythology that I want to recommend that didn't make the top 10, but it came close. And I read this play back in high school, but Antigone. This is Sophocles' play about the aftermath of his play Oedipus Rex, although he technically wrote Antigone before he wrote Oedipus Rex. But in the aftermath of the story of Oedipus, once he realizes that he's been sleeping with his mother for all these years, and he stabs out his eyes, and he realizes he's he's a cursed, blighted individual. But basically, there's a civil war after his death between his two sons about who's going to be the next king, and both the sons die. And so then Oedipus's wife's brother becomes the next king, and he says, well, one of these children can be buried and one of them can't, because one was defending the city, one was attacking the city. But the sister of the brothers, Antigone, she's horrified that one of her brothers is basically not going to get buried properly. She decides to do it anyway, and she gets punished and locked away in a cave and ends up hanging herself. And then the person who put her in the cave, he ends up relinquishing his crown and fleeing elsewhere. It's a really good adaptation of a classic Greek tragedy. And once again, Irene Papas is in that movie as well. So all three of these Greek movies that I saw adapting famous Greek tragedies, they all star Irene Papas. But Antigone from 1961, I just don't regard it as being quite on the level of Electra, and definitely not on the level of Iphigenia. But I feel like I've gone quite a ways at this point, talking just about my number 9. It is time to push on to my number 8. So for my number 8, we're going to wind the clock back 102 years to a movie released in Germany under the name Helena. It's basically two movies combined into one, The Rape of Helen and The Fall of Troy. But 1924, this was the era where every once in a while these really crazy motherfuckers would go off and make these giant historical epics where they would employ casts of thousands, and they would do things on the screen that have never been attempted really since then, because it just has become economically impossible to make a movie with a cast of thousands, because you have to feed them, you have to put them in wardrobe, to find a place for them to go to the bathroom. It's just easier to do it all with digital effects. But from the 1920s through the 1950s, people would still employ these casts of thousands. And I'm sure there were some Greek mythology movies made before 1924, but this is the earliest Greek mythology adaptation that I've seen. And it's basically just a full-blown adaptation of the Iliad, although it tells a lot of the story before the Iliad. If you read the Iliad, actually starts very deep into the story. It opens with Agamemnon and Achilles battling over this girl that they both want, and Achilles refusing to fight, and so on and so forth. But most movies that attempt to tackle the Iliad or the Trojan War decide to start the story much earlier with the abduction of Helen. But not only was this movie a giant enterprise that nearly bankrupted the German studio behind it, the movie was lost for many, many years. When it comes to silent movies, it seems like every year that goes by, there's always a situation where someone says, oh, by the way, I found this 3-hour pristine print of a movie in a vault somewhere or in an attic somewhere, and a movie that was previously thought to be lost is now back in circulation. And the same holds true for Helena. For a long time, this movie was basically just totally unavailable, but now it's available everywhere online. And the way that I watched it was with German title cards, but subtitled in English. But what I like about this movie is that every once in a while, it actually does choose to employ the gods and goddesses that are involved in the struggle. Because when you think about the Trojan War, it's basically a pissing contest between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, where they all tell Paris, I'll give you something really special if you say that I'm the most badass, beautiful goddess of them all. And Aphrodite offers the most beautiful woman in the world, which is why Paris goes with her. But so many movies about the Trojan War try to ignore all the gods and goddesses. And I think that's a huge mistake, because one of the most exciting things about reading about the Trojan War is when the gods will participate on the battlefield. Like when Paris kills Achilles, it's not just Paris randomly firing an arrow at him. Apollo guides his hand, because Apollo knows the one weak spot that Achilles has. And while I wouldn't argue that Helena is the most faithful adaptation of Greek mythology, it's certainly one of the most old-fashioned, just by virtue of the fact that the movie's more than 100 years old. And call me old-fashioned, but when I watch Greek mythology, I don't want modern-day interpretations. I don't want to hear the word daddy. I don't want to hear the word dad. I don't want Greek mythology made for modern audiences. I want all the barbarism and depraved behavior that one associates with stories that came out or that were written or shared 2,500 years ago. And so, yeah, just by virtue of being a 100-year-old movie, the movie is naturally just a more traditional, faithful adaptation of the text. But if I were to point to some of my favorite ingredients from this interpretation, first and foremost, we got to go with Achilles. He just looks and acts like a total badass from start to finish. He's huge, he's muscular, he's hell on wheels in combat. They just absolutely nailed those scenes. And I also really love the all the sequences involving the Trojan horse at the very end, because in this movie, and I would have to go back and reread these sections on the Iliad to see whether or not this was invented for the movie or a faithful adaptation. But when the Greeks are beginning to pour out of the Trojan horse, Helen and Paris are the first to see the Greeks as they emerge from the Trojan horse. They see Menelaus, and Helen tells Paris not to raise the alarm, at least as portrayed in this movie. And the reason she tells them this is because they're both going to be sacrificed the following morning. But there's this great scene where Menelaus fires an arrow at Paris, and Paris, takes the shot. He's like, oh, he's suffering and dying. But then Menelaus decides he's going to shoot Helen as well. It's like, whoa, that's pretty badass. And Paris decides to shield her with his body. But it's a great scene. And there's so many other great scenes early in the movie where we see Helen riding in a chariot being pulled by lions, like stuff that's just so dangerous. It's like, how did y'all even shoot this? But more than 100 years ago, they didn't have quite the safety standards on the set. And when you see an actress being pulled by two lions in a chariot, it's like, well, that's not CGI, that's not fake. The only way you could put that on the screen was to do it. But when discussing movies from a bygone era, especially silent movies made more than 100 years ago, it's important to acknowledge I wouldn't necessarily start like a small child on their journey to learning about Greek mythology with Helena. This is a movie for diehard cinephiles, diehard film historians. I love watching silent movies, but there's some silent movies like Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush, which you can show to anybody from any age, from any era, and they're just going to fall under its spell. With Helena, you have to kind of put on your hat where you're like, all right, I'm trying to learn about history here, but I'm not necessarily expecting it to give me the emotional escapism that I might get from a movie that's a little bit more contemporary. But there are movies from the 1920s that do provide it, but Helena, it's not quite on the level of a historical epic of something like, Ben-Hur. When you watch like the chariot sequence in Ben-Hur, you're like, oh my God, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. But there is an early precursor to the chariot sequence to Ben-Hur that we see in Helena. It's just on a much more reduced, kind of minimized scale. So I thoroughly enjoyed discovering this movie and seeing it for the first time. But I'm not going to lie to people and say, oh, invite a bunch of friends over and crack open a few beers and watch Helena. Like, if you're doing that, you should watch a movie like 300 or something along those lines. But I think at this point, it's time to move on to my number 7. And let me check my list because I've totally forgotten. Oh, well, since we're already on the subject of Helen of Troy, we might as well talk about the movie Helen of Troy from 1956. So this movie I saw for the first time in preparation for this video, and I very nearly gave up on it, but I'm thrilled that I did not, because it gets much better right around the halfway mark. The first half of the movie is just fucking awful. It is unwatchable. Every negative stereotype you can think about movies from the 1950s, it basically perfectly embodies, where we get this really lame, underwhelming love story between Paris and Helen, and it basically feels like you're watching like a fucking soap commercial. It is terrible, but I must say, this is directed by Robert Wise, and for those of you who know your film history, you'll know, oh, he directed the original West Side Story. He directed Star Trek the Motion Picture. He also edited Citizen Kane. He also was famous for helping butcher the Magnificent Ambersons. But Robert Wise, very famous filmmaker, made cool boxing movies like The Setup and things like that, but this was his attempt at doing Greek mythology. The movie is totally unendurable, totally insufferable, right up to the point where the Greeks begin to invade Troy. Then suddenly you're like, oh my God. Like when I was talking earlier about movies that were made in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s that employed casts of thousands, where you cannot make those kinds of movies anymore because they're just too impossibly expensive and too dangerous to make. But the invasion of Troy, as the Greeks are landing on the beach and charging in, is pretty goddamn spectacular, and unlike anything you'll see in 2026, where basically everything's done on a computer. And given Robert Wise's background editing movies like Citizen Kane, it should come as no surprise that he's got some great montage sequences in this movie. Like when the Greeks are arming themselves, preparing to go to war, that's fucking incredible. There's a pretty wild orgy scene late in the movie where for 1956, you're like, holy moly, yeah, this is about as risque as you're going to get in 1956. But it does work as a big, gigantic orgy sequence. And speaking of orgies, along those lines, a very young and very beautiful Brigitte Bardot appears in this movie as one of the slave girls attending to Helen. And when you watch this movie, Helen's not particularly stunning. Brigitte Bardot is, but she's not yet a star. I'm like, if y'all just swap those two roles, this movie would be dramatically better. Or if you just cut the first hour of the movie, it would be dramatically better. This movie is deeply flawed, but if you just want to see thousands of actors go into war, with siege engines and fire and just like beating the crap out of each other, this movie absolutely delivers on that front. So a very, very flawed film, but 100% worth watching for the highlights. Alrighty, but moving on to my number 6, we have yet another fresh discovery which I saw for the first time, and that is The Return from 2024, a modern movie directed by Uberto Pasolini and starring Ralph Fiennes as well as Juliette Binoche. And I have a feeling this movie is going to come up quite a bit throughout the summer of 2026 when people start making comparisons between this movie, which was made for like $5, and the Odyssey, which was made for what, like $250 million? Because The Return is the story of Odysseus, but it's just the final chapter. He is back in Ithaca. He's penniless. He's in rags. He's actually buck-ass new to start. He's old. He's got a big beard. And he basically has to kind of reinvent himself and figure out what's going on before he makes this move to become king of Ithaca again. And there's some people who absolutely love and adore The Return. And it's incredibly well made. For my money, it's got some really powerful scenes, but it's also agonizingly slow. When you watch this movie, you're like, oh my God, nothing's happening. But when it's good, it's incredibly good. Like at the very end, when all the suitors of Penelope are trying to string Odysseus' bow for that big challenge of shooting the arrow through the axis, because for people who know the Odyssey, that's when Odysseus decides to reveal himself. And all the suitors are failing at this challenge, and dressed as a beggar, he comes up and asks if he can take a crack at firing the bow. And there's this great scene where we see Ralph Fiennes like heating up the bow over a fire and then like strapping, it's one of those big, strong recurve bows that takes a lot of strength to even add the string to it. But the whole movie, he's been kind of this lost, wandering peasant in a lot of ways. But somehow in this scene, when he's restringing his bow, he becomes Odysseus again. And for me, Odysseus is the greatest of the Greek heroes. He has the most interesting story. Obviously, without Odysseus, the Greeks would have lost the Trojan War. But the story of the Odyssey, it is the story. I mean, some might argue that the Odyssey is the greatest story ever told, ever written in any era. And Ralph Fiennes just crushes it. I have a feeling that when it comes to the performance of Matt Damon as Odysseus in the Odyssey versus Ralph Fiennes in The Return, I don't think Matt Damon's going to be able to hold a candle to what Ralph Fiennes gave us. But because this movie kind of flew under the radar when it came out 2 years ago, I didn't even see it in the theater. I was aware of it, but I just skipped it. But my hope is that whether or not the Odyssey is good, bad, mediocre, or whatever, that it will drive people to discovering The Return for the first time, because it just has so many scenes that just absolutely make you weep. Like the scene where Odysseus bumps into his old hunting dog, Argos. It's been done very well in multiple movies, but there's something about this old leathery strategist coming home and his old as hell dog. A dog that's got to be like 20 years old at this point that he used to go hunting with. The dog's been sitting there loyally waiting for his master's return for years, and when he smells Odysseus and sees him, he kind of comes back to life and gets excited and licks his hand and that sort of thing. And then the dog soon passes away. But it's one of the most heartbreaking moments in all of Greek mythology. And The Return just knocked that scene right out of the park. And at the very end of the movie, when Odysseus decides to rid the world of all the suitors that have basically been plunging his kingdom into ruin in his absence, it's not so much a battle, it's just a massacre, because they're all unarmed. And so Ralph Fiennes is just sitting there. He's got a bow and arrow. Everybody's hiding behind columns and tables. And anytime somebody sticks like their butt out or like they're a little piece of flesh out, boom, thwack, he just takes them out. It's just a series of ruthless executions. So I really enjoyed The Return. That's why I chose it as my number 6. And I think the history will be very kind to the movie in the long run. But it's time to push into the top 5. And for my number 5, I've got a philosophical debate for you, because I don't know if this movie qualifies as a Greek myth or not, but I've asked a couple different people and they all say that it does. I'm still not entirely convinced, because if it is a Greek myth, then it certainly belongs on the list. But I think it's more of a history movie that's done in a mythological style. But I'm talking about 300, Zack Snyder's adaptation of the comic book or the graphic novel by the great Frank Miller.
This is Sparta!
And in 2026, given the state of a lot of modern day comic book adaptations, it's almost impossible to believe that a movie like 300 would even be possible 20 years ago, because obviously Zack Snyder is no longer the man that he once was. Rebel Moon and all of its various iterations are not nearly as good as 300, even if he's still trying to recapture the energy with that action style when filming the slow motion tableaus. But I think this movie owes a huge debt of gratitude to Robert Rodriguez and his interpretation of Sin City. because that was the first comic book adaptation where a filmmaker said, we are quite literally going to shove every single comic book panel into the camera and just try to recreate it as accurately and as faithfully as possible. 300 almost pulls it off to the same degree. My biggest complaint about 300 is that they added a lot of dramatic scenes that are not from the original graphic novel. Basically, every single scene involving politics. More often than not, those scenes were invented for the movie, and that's why those are the weakest scenes of the flick. The best stuff in the movie is all the best stuff from the graphic novel, where they're just quite literally trying to just recreate all the stunning images that Frank Miller first created on the page. And I rewatched this movie getting prepared for this video, and I kept saying to myself, not only has this movie aged very well, or at least like the battle scenes have aged very well, but it would be very tough to make this movie in the modern day because it does so many things that are frowned upon now. Like, first and foremost, an R-rated comic book adaptation. Those almost never get made now, or if they do get made, they're just they're horribly disappointing. But it's hard to think of the last great R-rated comic book adaptation, but a movie with nudity and gore and all these badass psychopaths with glistening muscles, craving that beautiful death that they keep seeking. Michael Fassbender is particularly good in this. I think you could make a case that he's even better than Gerard Butler in this movie because he's just such a total, complete badass from start to finish. And it's just great watching him in action. He's just so athletic and he's so invested in the role. But this is definitely one of the most influential Greek mythology movies ever made because it inspired an entire wave of movies that are trying to borrow that aesthetic or that style or that look. I mean, obviously, 300 Rise of an Empire in 2014 was not nearly as good, but it still had that look. People were trying to recreate the flavor that Zack Snyder was able to create on the set. Although 300 Rise of an Empire, I don't include that movie as like a Greek mythology movie because it's much more concerned with the history of the battles between the Spartans and the Persians, but it does have an epic sex scene featuring the lovely Ava Green. So if you like a little nudity mixed with your Greek history or mythology, definitely don't skip 300 Rise of an Empire. And also, she was in the sequel to Sin City. It's funny how both the big Frank Miller adaptations as movies, Sin City and 300, Ava Green's a huge star, and Buck-Ass Nude in the sequels in both franchises. But back to 300. In the end, this movie features badass characters doing badass things and saying badass shit as they do it. It's an absolute blast to watch. And if I were showing like a 10 or 11-year-old kid like their first Greek mythology movie, where I thought there'd be a very good chance they might take an interest, I might consider starting with 300 just because it's so visceral and so exciting, but there's some other contenders that I just rank a little bit higher. So let's move on to my number 4, the very first Greek mythology movie that I ever saw, Clash of the Titans from 1981. Now, this movie might have been directed by Desmond Davis, but it's most famous for the contributions of the legendary Ray Harryhausen, a true special effects wizard where if you're into stop-motion photography and stop-motion special effects, throughout the late 40s up through the early 80s, he gave us some of the best stop-motion sequences ever. And he's going to come up again a little bit later in this video, but when I first saw this movie, as I mentioned before, I was 1 month shy of my 5th birthday, and I think I was just in the perfect space to fall completely under this movie's spell, and I had not yet learned the story of Perseus at that time, so I didn't appreciate at that time the degree to which it was inventing some ingredients, but also borrowing ingredients from other myths, like the story of the Greek hero Bellerophon. He rode the Pegasus, not Perseus. In the story of Perseus, he uses the winged sandals of Hermes that are lent to him for his mission. But obviously, it's much more cinematic having a guy riding around on a Pegasus, on a flying horse. It looks great on camera, but that is not the story of Perseus. But it's become so popular through the movie Clash of the Titans, they just keep reusing it. Even in the 2010 remake, he's still riding the Pegasus. I'm like, the Pegasus does not belong to you. It belongs to quite a different hero. But as far as the 2010 remake is concerned and its sequel, Wrath of the Titans from 2012, I think both movies are absolute trash. I recognize there's some people out there who totally enjoy them. The movies were relatively successful, and I have some young relatives who do enjoy those movies. But if I'm watching Clash of the Titans, I'm only watching the original. And I'm convinced the remake was successful for one reason and one reason only: hearing Liam Neeson say, "Release the Kraken." That was some epic hardcore shit. But that's the only ingredient that I'll concede was pretty good in the remake. But we do have Laurence Olivier as Zeus in the original. When you look at the cast that played all the gods of Mount Olympus in the original movie, it's like, oh my God, Ursula Andress as Aphrodite? Yeah, like, yes please, more of that please. She's the very first Bond girl, and of course she's going to play Aphrodite in 1981. And we got Maggie Smith in there, and Pat Roach, and a bunch of other good actors. But we also have Burgess Meredith in here, and I think that Harry Hamlin actually makes a pretty goddamn good Perseus. And anytime you're making a movie about Greek mythology, it always helps if you have amazing music. And Lawrence Rosenthal contributed an incredible score. Also, this is one of the last movies from the great heyday of PG-rated nude scenes. You might be thinking to yourself, what is a PG-rated nude scene? Well, back in the day, when you just had PG and R and there was no PG-13, oftentimes PG movies would have very chaste, kind of innocent nude scenes, but there would still be nude scenes all the same. And this is one of those movies that actually gave us some of those early classic PG-rated nude scenes. But if I had to put my finger on why this movie's remained enduringly popular for the last 45 years, it's got to be for two sequences. The sequence involving the Medusa and the sequence involving the Kraken. And while stop motion effects might seem like truly like an antiquated art form to modern filmgoers, there's something about Harryhausen's imagination which just absolutely works all these years later, because when I was a kid, that sequence involving the Medusa, it fucking terrified me. The fact that she could not only turn you to stone, but even if you turned your back, she could still put an arrow in your back or whatever the case might be. I mean, she was just absolutely hell on wheels. It was a great scene, which leads to one of the most iconic shots in all of movie history when it comes to Greek mythology. Harry Hamlin holding at the Medusa head and turning the Kraken into stone. It just fucking rules. And I saw this movie in the theater, but I must have seen it 150 times on HBO as a little kid, and I just ate it up each and every single time. So even if it annoys me to the present day how many liberties they took with the original story, there's no denying the emotional power of the movie. My spirit soars when I hear that score, and there's so many great sequences. And Ray Harryhausen, once again, there's nothing quite like seeing Ray Harryhausen when his imagination is completely and totally unbridled. But put a pin in Harryhausen. We're going to come back to him. But before we get to Harryhausen, we got to talk about two other movies. Let's talk about Troy, which is my number 3. A movie that I have a ton of complaints about, but there's no denying that for a lot of people, this is their favorite movie about Greek mythology. And there are a lot of sequences that work quite well. And it's directed by Wolfgang Petersen. He's a phenomenal filmmaker. He made movies like In the Line of Fire or The Never-Ending Story. He's a very talented filmmaker. And this movie is the poster child for the Greek mythology movie, where there's some ingredients that I absolutely loathe and despise, and there's some ingredients that I absolutely love and adore. The best ingredient for me by far is the tension between Achilles and Agamemnon, because Brian Cox just sells it. As uninterested as Brad Pitt might seem in the drama at hand and actually reading his lines of dialogue, at least Brad Pitt got in terrific shape for the movie. He's a complete and total physical specimen in this movie, and you get to see his nude butt cheeks many times over. If that's your thing, enjoy the view. But he and Brian Cox just have so many great scenes where Brian Cox obviously wants to be the leader, but he knows he can't do shit without Achilles and his Myrmidons out there on the field kicking all kinds of ass. But what I don't like about this movie is how it bleeds all the mythology right out of the story. It might as well just be any conventional war movie that takes place, at some point, like in the Bronze Age. So why call it Troy? Why even use these characters? Why give us Hector and Paris and Helen and all these incredible characters if you're not going to adapt the original Greek myths? Because throughout the entire movie, they keep trying to come up with explanations as to why the Greek myths were not true. Like Achilles is not invulnerable in this, and he tells a little kid early on he's using a shield because he can be killed. But if you want to see a movie where Helen of Troy, formerly Helen of Sparta, but now Helen of Troy, is one of the most beautiful women that you've ever seen, where your eyeballs will melt right out of your skull, Diane Kruger has got you covered, because like Brad Pitt, she also shows a little bit of skin in this movie. And those scenes are, they're easy on the eyes. And I think Eric Bana does a great job as Hector as well, because one of the things I've always found interesting about the Trojan War is how on the Greek side, you've got so many legendary heroes, whether it's Odysseus or Achilles or Ajax the Greater or Ajax the Lesser or Agamemnon or Menelaus. Like there's just one legendary figure after another. But on the Trojan side, you only have Hector, and I've always felt like Hector's role in the war is a very lonely one, because he's the one person on the Trojan side that can kind of trade body blows with the greatest heroes on the Greek side. And so he just has such a huge burden that he has to carry. He's the one stud, and he's basically, without Hector, Troy would have fallen very, very quickly. And I think Eric Bana really did a fabulous job with that character. But there's so many scenes that I just find to be infuriating, like the duel between Menelaus and Paris. Because in the Iliad as written, when Paris starts to lose that battle, because Paris is totally outmatched, Aphrodite swoops in, picks up Paris, takes him to the bedroom of Helen, and they just get it on while everybody else keeps fighting. But in this movie, Paris basically crawls over to Hector's feet, and Hector says, the battle's over. Menelaus dies soon thereafter, and then the battle continues. But Menelaus is supposed to survive throughout the Trojan War, and you just can't take major characters from Greek mythology and just give them a completely different ending to their story. And that's the kind of crap that just absolutely drives me crazy. Because if this story had employed more of the gods and goddesses that were involved in the war, and had actually taken a more mythological approach and had stayed true to the story of the Iliad, it would be my favorite Greek mythology movie ever made. I just think it's a very, very flawed film. A thrilling movie, very exciting movie, has some badass battle scenes, some badass scenes, but if you haven't watched it in a long time, definitely hunt down the director's cut. I think I was very harsh to this movie when it came out theatrically back in 2004, but I think it's aged very well, and I think the director's cut is 100% worth checking out. All right, it's time to talk about my number 2, which is yet another adaptation of the Odyssey, but it is Ulysses from 1954, an Italian film directed by Mario Camerini, if I'm saying his name correctly, but it stars Kirk Douglas, but the whole movie is in Italian, which is absolute music to the ears while watching it. Every Greek myth deserves at least one Italian interpretation, but I first saw it many decades ago, dubbed in English, as a camper, and at my camp that I went to, it was a sailing camp, but once a week, they would whip out this old 16 millimeter projector, maybe it was 35 millimeter, but it's probably 16 millimeter, maybe 8 millimeter. And they would show us a movie, and they must have been re-showing over and over again this same print of Ulysses for decades at that point, because it was kind of like one of those old-fashioned, wholesome camps. But I remember being frustrated at the time that all my fellow campers, and this would have been 1985 or 86, that all my fellow campers were not equally interested in the story as I was, because at that time I was already totally obsessed with Greek mythology. But really, the only thing holding this movie back from being the greatest Greek mythology movie ever made is the budget, because they're doing the entire story of the Odyssey, but they're definitely kind of fast forwarding through some parts that might be disproportionately expensive, because the story of the Odyssey is it's so big, it's so grand, it's hard to do the entire story justice. But the way they frame the story so they can kind of jump around in the story, Ulysses washes ashore on this island that's very near to Ithaca. He's almost home, but he has amnesia. He has no memory of the Trojan War or his long journey home or anything like that. But he's embraced as a guest of honor, and they're having all these incredible athletic contests. And Kirk Douglas is just ripped in this, and he's wrestling with people, and they're throwing the discus and doing all these incredible games and contests. And he falls in love, and he's about to get married. But one day he's looking out at the ocean, and he starts having these flashbacks, and he starts having flashbacks of his men dying at sea when they were trying to escape Circe. And suddenly all these little chapters start coming back to him. So we get a great version of their encounter with the Cyclops and how they get him drunk and put out his eye. We get a great version of the story when they encounter Circe and the men are turned into pigs, and Odysseus ends up getting to talk to some of his dead friends in the underworld. And so they're kind of jumping around. Oh, we get a great scene with the sirens when he lashes himself to the mast of the ship because he doesn't want. He wants to hear them sing, but he doesn't want to kill all his men by wrecking his ship into the rocks. So if you want to see the Odyssey done right in an old school kind of badass fashion, this movie gets the job done. It just doesn't have the budget to do the whole story. But what is there is fucking awesome. There's a minimum of changes. Kirk Douglas was born to play Ulysses, aka Odysseus. And I don't think a better actor will ever play the role. It's just not quite as good as my favorite Greek mythology movie ever made, Jason and the Argonauts from 1963, which brings us back into the world of Ray Harryhausen. So Jason and the Argonauts was directed by Don Chaffee and stars Todd Armstrong as Jason. And what I've always loved about the story of Jason is that Jason's a badass, but his mission to get this golden fleece, he knows he needs to get a team of the greatest adventurers of this era, and so he hosts a series of games to basically recruit this incredible legendary team of heroes to go on this crazy adventure. And in the original myth, he's got Hercules and Orpheus and Castor and Pollux and Theseus and all these total badasses. It's basically the closest we get to an Avengers Assemble moment before we finally get to the Trojan War, much deeper into Greek mythology. But what I think this movie nails better than any other Greek mythology movie ever made is just the tone, the style, the atmosphere. I just believe that this world exists. And it helps that they got Bernard Herrmann composing the score to this movie. And for people who don't know, Bernard Herrmann His career started with Citizen Kane, and his career ended with Taxi Driver. And in between, he did a lot of scores for people like Alfred Hitchcock, but a strong contender for the greatest composer in movie history. And here he is doing the score for Jason and the Argonauts. So from word one, during this incredible title sequence with all this gorgeous old school art over all these cracked urns, immediately I'm just like, all right, they're not trying to modernize it. They're not trying to change it. They're just trying to make this as authentic and cool as humanly possible. And it also helps when you have actors like Honor Blackman, Pussy Galore herself, playing Hera. It's a rare story where Hera is actually one of the good guys. We're used to Hera always being the jealous wife who's trying to kill all the heroes that have been begat by Zeus screwing around down on Earth. But this is a rare situation where Hera is rooting for Jason and giving him advice every step of the way. But for me, any movie that's going to be considered as a contender for the greatest Greek mythology movie ever made, more or less has to get the story right. They can zig and zag in a few places, but they got to get the structure right. They got to get the tone right. The only real changes this movie makes is like including the Hydra. Like Ray Harryhausen just thought the Hydra looked cool, so he included the Hydra in the movie. But in Greek mythology, it was Hercules or Heracles who killed the Hydra. And famously, if you chop off one head, two heads grow in its place. But cinematically, it's just such a beautiful looking creature. And Ray Harryhausen just was really excited to animate that creature. Although I think he went with 2 fewer heads. I think the original Hydra had 9 heads. I think it has 7 heads in the movie. Ordinarily, when people are praising the special effects for this movie, the number one scene that comes up is the final battle with all those incredible skeletons, just because from an animation standpoint, it was really, really challenging to animate multiple skeletons fighting Jason and his men. But I actually prefer 2 other scenes to the skeleton scene. One of the scenes that I really love is when Jason and the Argonauts are trying to sail through this area where these cliffs are famous for crashing together. And I always thought it was Poseidon who in the movie is holding the cliff back from crushing them. But I believe it's actually Triton, one of the sons of Poseidon, who's holding back the cliffs so they can sail through. And it's not stop motion, but there's something just so compelling and believable about this giant mythological creature rising up out of the water to save these heroes as they sail through. But my favorite sequence by far is the sequence involving Talos, or Talos. I think they call him Talos in the movie, but I've always pronounced it Talos. But I think the most iconic shot in any movie dealing with Greek mythology ever is when the Argonauts are trying to sail away and Talos is striding over basically these 2 islands, looking down at them, and scoops that boat up and just starts killing people. But what I love about this entire sequence on this island is that it gets at the root of so many classic Greek myths that are basically like a cautionary tale about not falling prey to temptation. Because in this situation, the Argonauts are running out of food and water. They ask for advice from Hera. She says, look, there's a nearby island. You can gather food and water, but nothing else, and you'll survive, and you can go on about your way. But if you touch anything else, there'll be horrible consequences. Well, so many myths and religions all employ these kinds of temptation scenarios. So they go to the island, they're gathering up food and drink and so on and so forth. But of course, Hercules goes exploring, finds this giant bronze statue guarding this hoard of treasure. He's like, well, whoever owns this treasure, they're not going to miss a few gold pieces or a few trinkets. He gathers up a few items. And then in one of the most bone-chilling and eerie sequences of Harryhausen's career, first they just hear a few sounds, but then you see this giant bronze statue come into life. It's so cool and so beautiful and so terrifying. And I just feel like during that entire sequence on the island, Greek myths live and breathe again on the big screen. We're just the essence of Greek mythology and what makes them so cool and fascinating and terrifying and thrilling. It's all captured in that lengthy sequence. And it's just, I think it's the best work of Ray Harryhausen's career. It's the finest sequence that I've ever seen in any Greek mythology movie ever. And for anybody who disagrees with my ranking, I welcome any and all pushback to my choices, because obviously there have been so many movies, and also there are a lot of Greek mythology movies that I have not seen. As I mentioned earlier, there were 19 Hercules movies made in Italy alone in the 50s and early 60s. There are a lot to choose from, but I'm starting to feel my voice fade, so I'm going to have to tap out and wrap up this video. There's more that I could say, but hopefully over the course of this video, who knows how long it'll be by the time I finish editing it, hopefully you've gotten some good reading recommendations for the future. Hopefully you've gotten some good movie recommendations, but what I really hope is to get some recommendations from you down in the comments below. Like, what are some great adaptations of myths by some other authors? Like, I've got this book by Robert Graves about all the Greek myths, which I've never read a page of. I loved his book, I, Claudius, which is fucking awesome. If you're interested in Roman history, read I, Claudius. So I was like, you know what? I love Robert Graves' I, Claudius. Definitely need to get this, but I've never read a page. I've also got a copy of Bullfinch's Mythology which my buddy Nick Berry gave me as a graduation present from college, and like the first half of it or so is about Greek myths. I definitely want to read that, but every once in a while, someone like Deleuze will come along and kind of do their own interpretation where it works. I'm not a fan of, nor am I interested in, like modern day lingo. Like there's a rumor that Christopher Nolan has based his adaptation of the Odyssey on a translation of the Odyssey from like 2016 or 17, which employs a lot of modern dialogue. That doesn't interest me at all. But if there are any classic Greek mythology interpretations or translations or movies that I've overlooked in this video, let me know, because I feel like this is an area where it is worthy of lifelong study. I think when people get old enough to a certain point, Roman history and Greek history just start calling their name, and you start getting obsessed with the distant past. So I'm open to any and all suggestions on that front. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting that notification bell. I would greatly appreciate it. And I look forward to resuming this debate and discussion about Greek mythology in a few short weeks when the Odyssey finally reaches the big screen. But thanks again for watching. I greatly appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.